It's the Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 12, Testament. Welcome to the Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 12, Testament. I'm Mark Rudolph.
And I'm Jason Hundy. So this is kind of one of our first thrash-oriented shows, I guess. I mean, Sepultura had some thrash elements, but they were kind of thrash death metal. But Testament's always sort of been considered one of the godfathers of thrash, up there with the big four, you know, Anthrax, Slayer, Megadeth, and Metallica.
Yeah, never really got they've always kind of got ripped on a little bit for being kind of redundant of, you know, Exodus and Metallica, but they were one of the under-the-radar thrash bands that I really got into when I was younger. And the last, about 4 or 5 months, I actually went back and bought all the old records and finally, because I went through a phase where I just kind of weeded out all the junk, or what I thought was junk, out of my collection. I heard Practice and Souls of Black not too long ago, and I was like, man, I really need to get this stuff again. It's holds up really well.
And I know you were kind of unfamiliar with most of the 90s stuff that I kind of got hooked onto because I was a little bit younger, you know. And
yeah, Ritual, I ended on that record, and I don't think I heard anything past that. I was just like, yeah, Dogface God, it sounds like they're trying to move off death metal. But
I think a lot of people ended on Ritual, but we'll kind of talk more about, you know, the progression that Testament takes. But I think one of the reasons we were sort of interested in doing a show about a band like Testament is because, you know, they were sort of second tier thrash, along with Death Angel and Dark Angel and all the Angel groups apparently. But they came
Forbidden,
out,
a lot of these stuff.
They came out a little bit later too. You know, their first record doesn't debut till '87, and by that point, I mean, Metallica's put out 3 records, Megadeth's put out 3 records, Slayer's put out, you know, quite a few records by that point, including a live CD, and
Exodus is pretty well established.
Yeah, and Anthrax is pretty well established as well. And so I think you're right. They kind of come in at a kind of an awkward time, just as the scene is exploding in terms of commercial popularity. They're trying to lay their roots and trying to figure out sort of their path, and they kind of got pulled in a lot of directions. Are they going to be, you know, Exodus? Are they going to be Slayer? Are they going to be Metallica?
And they're stuck in that whole Bay Area scene, and this was when, you know, the whole cock rock thing was exploding, and it was a little bit they seemed like just a little bit out of time for their own good, I think.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. You know, we were listening to some of the older stuff from the Legacy and New Order, and thematically there's a lot of occult kind of things going on, satanic almost themes, but yet
they're kind of riding the line between Slayer and Metallica as far as subject matter went, or just
but I don't detect an evilness that you hear on the Slayer records.
They've always felt really upbeat to me for some reason. I don't know.
Yeah, so you know, they quickly kind of move away from that stuff, you know, later, but into more political realms and social justice realms, you know, talking about Greenhouse Effect, and
which I think almost every band. I mean, you look at you know, Justice for All and Rust in Peace, that whole era. After you get about 3 albums under your belt, you're like, I'm in my mid-20s. I think I kind of care about global issues. now, so.
It's no longer just death and Satan and you know killing people and all that sort of stuff. Unless you're Slayer, and then you continue to talk about that stuff, but. You know, I guess Slayer almost does it in a social context way, where they're commenting on our obsession with violence, you know.
Yeah,
so.
You look at Seasons and there's all kinds of stuff going on.
Yeah, well, gun, you know, warfare and stuff, expendable youth and stuff. Yeah, exactly. But, you know, anyways, back to, you know, kind of what Testament was doing is they were such a, we said, kind of a weird band, because they just as they were trying to find their voice, you know, with Practice What You Preach, you know, Metallica was about to record the Black Record, and Megadeth was about to do Rust in Peace and Seasons of the Abyss, and Anthrax was kind of, you know, entering their sort of big commercial phase with,
they didn't quite have
Bring the Noise and some of these experimental things.
Yeah, they always seem like they're just a couple years behind, but they're still doing solid stuff.
Sure. And they really sort of ran their course almost in a way, and then one of the few thrash bands I think has been able to reinvent themselves in a totally new direction, and in fact, oddly enough, get heavier. You know, that's one of the unique things. That's kind of, I think, why you and I zoned in on this band to do a show about them, because whereas a lot of these bands are probably better put out to pasture, you know, the good old days are far behind them, Testament kind of continues to sort of impress, and they've been through a lot of adversity in terms of, we'll talk about that with the cancer stuff, but they've just recently also put out this fantastic record called The Formation of Damnation, and It's on Nuclear Blast, a label known for death metal and other things that.
And it's got a big push. I mean, I've seen stuff on MTV recently, which it seems like a really odd choice, but
yeah, and they debuted pretty well. I think we were just sort of poking around. I think it
59 in the Billboard chart,
like
which is for a metal record's not bad. From my limited recollections of what's been on the chart lately. But.
Yeah, and it's hard to say who's buying what. But anyways, the band is a pretty interesting band that will sort of like flesh out a little bit of their history as we sort of go through without getting like overly academic, which we don't want to kill you with too much information.
Well, we talked about a little bit before we recorded just about how they almost had the same kind of dynamic as Doc, and I've got this like this guitar that was a guitarist that really can't, you're trying to like contain him or get him to actually fit in a genre, and it's totally it seems like the Testament kind of services Skolnick.
Yeah, Alex Skolnick, this sort of wonderkind, young guitar player when he first joined Testament. Yeah. I think he was 16 or 17, somewhere around there. And, the big accusation about Testament, especially in those early albums, was that, the band was just sort of making a cliched palette for him to sort of play with, It's like, oh, it's time for Skolnick's, solo to, to jump in. And I could say that about a handful of the songs on some of the records, and certainly probably towards, Souls of Black and The Ritual, when their sound was starting to get a little bit tired. And it was basically like, okay, what can Skolnick do to sort of inject some life into some of these songs, much like you said with Lynch and Dokken. The guys in Dokken weren't very exceptionally talented, except they were just sort of making songs that like Lynch could kind of play around with. But I think we'll get to some of that stuff later, but I think when Skolnick leaves, it allows for Testament to grow into almost a better band in some ways, which is kind of cool.
I think it put them in a direction that I don't think if they would have just kind of carried on, they would have just kind of beat themselves to death. But losing that really dynamic guitar player, Peterson could just he was always a good rhythm writer, but he was never great with leads, so they just kind of worked with what they had, and ended up building a great roster of guest musicians along the way, and
it really just, I think, helped everybody develop as musicians and vocals and all these other elements. But I think before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we're dropping some names here, but the original lineup of Testament featured Chuck Billy on vocals, and we'll talk a lot about his styles and developments that he makes, and then the two guitar players, Alex Skolnick, and the more rhythm player was Eric Peterson, who and Billy and Peterson have been the ones that have stuck through the whole band.
Yep.
And then the original bass player, Greg Christensen, and Louis Clemente was on drums, who was in some ways maybe the weak point of the band, I think, early on.
Yeah.
He didn't have the chops that Lombardo did or Boss Staff.
He was really playing stock stuff. I mean, listen to most of his drum lines, and they don't really vary off course the entire track.
Yeah, and it's really unfortunate. I think... I think when we get to the end of that first cycle of Testament, his drums have really gone about as far as he's going to be able to go. And then, they start bringing in John Tempesta, Gene Hoglan, Dave Lombardo. I mean, big time players. And I think it fits what Testament's sound wants to do beyond in the 90s and beyond when they start to get a little bit bigger. But in terms of a little bit of band history, they used to be called The Legacy. Originally, Steve Souza, who went on and sang for Exodus, sang for Testament's, I guess, the pre-Testament years.
Version.
And then Derek Ramirez was playing bass for them before Christensen joined, and Ramirez will actually show up years later on Demonic, which is kind of cool, to bring him back into the fold. And so it's like I said, a younger band because they came out in 87. They're not as old as the Metallica's, Exodus's, and Slayer's are, but and
that could have been part of the key to why they actually had the longevity to keep going through that. They didn't kind of hit their peak early on. And
yep. And Skolnick, he takes a totally weird path, and we'll get into that later too as well. So it's just, a very interesting band. I don't think they're one of the few bands you can't sort of stamp a generic label on. Slayer has a very much a continuous sort of path that they were on. In some ways, Metallica does too, except they really detoured right after the Black Album. But you could see them inching a little bit towards commercialization with some of that.
But Slayer's really, they've had basically this identity set out for themselves from the start, and they can't deviate too far from that, or they're going to totally kind of, might as well start a new band.
Sure. Anthrax, I feel the same way. Megadeth.
But with Testament, it seems like they're one of the few bands that have made not a seamless transition, but a really kind of obvious and it seems like it really like kind of reflected where they're at the time to actually move into this more death metal realm.
Yeah.
And I can't think of another singer outside of Billy that's actually made the jump from thrash straight into death metal sounding singing, and it sounds like great.
Yeah.
Like, really solid stuff.
Yeah.
And then he can go back and forth on their newer records, actually, like, there's a really good dynamic there. It doesn't seem like he's just trying to jump onto the bandwagon to the certain sound or anything, so...
Yep, I totally agree with you in that part, and that's one of the things that's made this band sort of near and dear to me, from when I discovered them, because I discovered them almost in their post-thrash years with, like, Low. I heard Return to Serenity on MTV Headbangers Ball and stuff, but, like, it sounded like a Metallica song to me at the time, and so I was like, oh, cool, whatever. And then I sort of, jumped on the bandwagon when they were getting into death metal, and then it was really weird going back and listening to the thrash stuff, so it's kind of...
the thrash stuff was all I knew, so it was like, I was just kind of put off, and there's so many other things coming out at the time, I was just like, well, Testament's tired and old, I don't really care about listening to them anymore. But.
Yeah, which is, I think, what Testament was thinking, too, and that's why I think they were like, we gotta forge something, and they made some poor mistakes and I think experimental things. Like, there's some songs on Low that are just really forgettable, but I think they were trying anything, and seeing what would stick in terms of their sound. So, but let's get into some music here. We're gonna listen to some stuff from The Legacy, and The Legacy was put out, like we said, in 1987, and had some pretty harsh kind of stuff going on. There's a song I was telling Mark about called Raging Waters, which makes some satanic references, and Burnt Offerings is about burning in hell, and really kind of a dark, eerie sort of theme. And it's the cover is so, like, it's almost Spinal Tap metal. It's like a floating sort of skull. Metal like head thing,
sitting in a little alcove with some text, or it's like a summoning
in
or something.
Ancient church or something. But that was what the thrash scene was all about. Aesthetically, it sort of fit right into that. But this, unfortunately, we're gonna use some songs off of this record, but the production is a little bit thin, and it's really an album that needs to be remastered. And Testament attempted to try and get the rights to remaster this in the New Order, which are their first two records, and unfortunately they ran into some legal issues. They couldn't get them from Megaforce or whatever, and so they actually went out, and we should mention it, even though we're not going to play any examples from it, but they went out and re-recorded these songs, I think 2002, and First Strike, Still Deadly. And so if you like this stuff, but you're kind of saying to yourself as you're hearing it, like, man, the production is really thin.
Vocals especially, it sounds like they recorded like different location, different time. It's almost like this, disembodied vocals over the top of the stuff. It doesn't really fit, but
yeah. So you should check out, if you think what we're talking about, if you hear those sort of elements, go out and definitely check out that re-recording record. And if we had a lot more time, we'd obviously, maybe do some comparisons so you could hear what one sounded like compared to another.
Yeah, because this is kind of us going back into the old style of the first couple episodes, so we're trying to keep it concise and just get you interested in the band, really.
Exactly. And if it's something that you're about, their entire back catalog is fairly strong. There's a couple records you could probably stand to skip at first until you get into the completist mode like we are, so. But we're gonna hear the first two tunes actually off the record, and Over the Wall and The Haunting. And Over the Wall features sort of like I guess you would say one of the standard things that Exodus was doing at the time, which is sort of the sing-along vocals, and sort of they're all kind of yelling vocals, gang vocals.
Almost kind of reminiscent of like the hardcore, backing vocal screams, all the guys going in unison kind of thing.
Yeah, and then their sound really was this balance between, like we said, Metallica, Exodus, and a little bit of that sort of chug chromatic scale stuff that Anthrax will do. And it's no mystery that I think the first band they toured with they were the supporting act for Anthrax, like right off this record. So, and then The Haunting is cool because, like we said, there's Mark and I were talking about this song earlier. There's some real Slayer-ish kind of elements to it, and it's really one of the eerier songs that Testament will write.
Where he's getting those real high screams like I was doing the first couple records. So.
Yeah, so enjoy this, and then we'll also be hearing another tune, Disciples of the Wash, which we'll talk about in our next set. welcome back. You just heard Over the Wall, The Haunting, and Disciples of the Watch. And that last tune, Disciples of the Watch, which is a really neat tune, kind of some noodling from Skolniak in the beginning intro. That comes from Testament's second record, The New Order, which, I don't know if you have a preference or not between the first
two. You can't see the skull very much on that one.
Yeah, I think it's there, but I think my clear plastic is a little. Oh, there you go.
Oh, okay.
It looks very like Castle Grayskullish from Masters of the Universe, He-Man's type stuff. But New Order's the first old thrash record I heard from these guys. I actually heard it before Practice What You Preach and before The Legacy, and so this one's always had like a fondness to my heart. And if we had more time, we definitely rock out Trial by Fire, which is another really pretty
kind of like
song.
One of their standard Barrett tunes, yeah.
And Into the Pit was another tune off this record, which they basically wrote the same reason that Anthrax wrote Caught in a Mosh, and Toxic Waltz from X. It's just let's beat the hell out of each other in the pit kind of
mosh
thing.
pit songs, yeah.
So, but so hopefully you enjoyed that from New Order, and you're going to tell us a little bit about Practice What You Preach, which is really kind of the first one you kind of got into, you and Chris.
Yeah, our silent co-host here. He'll show up here pretty soon. And he's actually, we talked about him a little bit in the Repulsion episode, and this kind of actually dovetails into that. Back in Flint in 88, 89, Chris went into Rock-A-Rolla Records, which is a small record store in Flint, asking for, hey man, you got Testament, Practice What You Preach, and guys like at the counter, he's like, hey, maybe you should check out this Repulsion record, this is pretty hip. He's like, nah, I only got $10.
So he bought the Testament record.
He bought the Testament record, and we find out that the clerk was actually Scott Carlson from Repulsion, and in turn he actually turned Chris on to White Earp Records as well, which was more genre-centric, heavy metal, death metal, all kinds of extreme underground stuff store.
And also the label that was put out the first
Repulsion record. So yeah, that's kind of an interesting thing. I talked to him today about that a little bit to see where the Testament origins came in. But this was the first record I actually had this on tape, and kind of opened me up beyond just the Rust in Peace, Metallica, and Anthrax, and all that kind of era
the big
stuff.
Four,
so,
yeah. The weirdest part about that story is, why didn't Carlson work at Wyatt Earp Records? You know what I mean?
Oh, I think it was just Doug Wyatt and this other guy that just kind of helped out occasionally. It was a really tiny store.
Okay.
I mean, it was like smaller than my living room.
That makes a little bit more sense.
Because Rock and Roll was fairly big. I think they had a couple chain stores throughout Michigan back in the day. But
so Carlson's like that standard guy, the one cool guy who works at like a corporate kind of bigger, Tower Records kind of store who actually knows something about music. I find it really interesting nowadays. It's like, now that all these record stores are closing down, especially in our state, and I'm sure everybody out there listening knows that.
Unless you're in a major metropolitan city, the record store is kind of gone.
And it's like, and it's almost like the people they hire are like less and less knowledgeable, because it almost fits like, they don't want to be too like niche-y or high fidelity like, and so like, let's hire some brainless idiot who listens to, everything that's mainstream, and so I don't know. I digress. So, but back to Practice What You Preach. This is, consistently the fan favorite, and I think the critical favorite of Testament.
I think it's kind of they hit their peak. This is before they started kind of like struggling a little bit with their sound and like, where are we going to go? This is kind of like the epic of the zenith of their early thrash career, really. So,
and it has a lot of dynamics still working for it, which is, like you said, they don't get as repetitious like they do in like Souls of Black and The Ritual.
And the production's like fantastic on this.
Sure, and the title track was, I think, one of their bigger tunes in terms of like rotation on Headbangers Ball and MTV, Practice What You Preach, and that tune and Perilous Nation are kind of the two that we selected. But there's a whole bunch of other ones that we talked about. Nightmare is a particular favorite of yours, kind of just
it's just a pretty straight ahead track, but
short but sweet. And then
the ballad.
The ballad is really interesting. We'll talk more about the ballad when we get into a tune that I think they take this sort of standard, how to write like a metal ballad, and they kind of do it a little bit better, I think, years later with Return to Serenity. But the ballad's like their first attempt to write kind of like a Fade to Black, Welcome Home Sanitarium kind of record. So, like you said, it's not just sort of straight ahead thrashing. There's a lot of different dynamics and things sort of happening on here, and The other thing that's really interesting is they sort of lyrically take a different turn here. And like you said, it's like they've kind of grown up at this point and they got to start thinking about social issues.
Yeah.
Because you got Greenhouse Effect and, Practice What You Preach is obviously sort of a condemnation of sort of the hypocrisy of religion and, all these sort of standard elements you see.
Standard thrash kind of stuff.
A lot of thrash stuff. So it's kind of a cool thing. But we're going to rock this out and then get into one of the tunes that you really liked off Souls at Black, which is called One Man's Fate. But we'll probably talk about that when you get back.
Sure.
So...
place was meant to be. your maker, free your pain, free your hatred that we obtain. Tell me what this place was meant to be. Can you see what it does to me? Can you hear, can you read, can you see what it did to me? Can you hear, can you read, can you see what it did to me? Can you hear, can you read, can you see what it did to me? Did to, did to.
Welcome back. You're listening to the show on Testament here, and that was One Man's Fate you just heard. Before that, Practice What You Preach and Perilous Nation from the aforementioned Practice What You Preach. But what are your thoughts? You're way more familiar with Souls at Black and some of that stuff.
I mean, it had that same kind of feeling as Metallica Black Album. They're really well produced, almost like the height of what thrash metal could really do. And everybody was at the top of their game, but they weren't necessarily as hungry as they were on last record. It seems like they're just kind of resting on their laurels a little bit. It's a good record, but nothing really like jumps out huge. It's kind of hard to actually pick one track off this. And Souls of Black's a decent song, but there's not a whole lot going on there.
Sure.
So I just tried to pick something that kind of like encompassed a little bit of what they were doing at this time, and just to get something from the record on there. But yeah, it's just a real standard, solid record. It's nothing really jumps out. It's no Practice What You Preach, but it definitely has more energy and vigor than
the Ritual.
The Ritual is really stock and boring.
Yeah,
I was really disappointed when I got that as a kid.
Yep. And I think Souls at Black is cool. The cover's probably my favorite of those early Testament covers.
Yeah, between that and Practice What You Preach, they had like a real high quality of I don't know who was painting these covers at the time, but it's just like, oh, that's a great metal cover.
Yeah, and I think probably by this point, with the success maybe that And Justice for All had, and maybe South of Heaven and some of these other records, that maybe Atlantic Records, which is what was putting out Testament at this point, was maybe pumping quite a bit of production money and promotion money into these guys.
Testament just never caught on. They just didn't have, I don't know what it was, but
that it factor, whatever.
Apparently, they weren't as outspoken as as Metallica or something. They didn't have all the Alcoholica stuff going on or whatever.
Yeah, and I don't think they had that sort of strong personality like a Lars or Kerry
not
King
really,
or Scotty Ian or somebody, or
they
Dave
didn't seem
Mustaine.
they didn't seem to have like the band fights as much as everybody else, and I don't know, they're just like not as confrontational of a band.
So they really should have sold the whole Skolniak wanting to go mainstream element a lot more and created some attention to themselves or something, because at this point when we're talking about the band, right before, in between Souls at Black and the Ritual, they kind of made a more conscious effort to try and mainstream their sound. And this was on part due to some of the tensions that were existing in the band, like Chuck Billy and Eric Peterson wanted to continue to be firmly in the thrash metal scene, whereas Skolniak and I think Louis Clemente, the drummer, wanted to take it into more of a mainstream metal kind of, just hard rock, heavy
why
metal
Christensen
kind of
left? Was that?
Well, Christensen will stay through Low, so I don't know. I can't remember the reasons why he will eventually leave. If it's just the band kind of felt like they'd run their course, because there's like a 3 or 4 year long period between Low and Demonic, so maybe everybody kind of went their separate ways for a while. But so back to this sort of fight that was going on within the band. The end product is the Ritual, which, as you said, is a fairly weak record. It's very stock thrash. Yeah. And I think it came out in 91, 92 actually. And by 92, if you're talking about like the music scene as a whole, especially like the MTV sort of metal scene, Nirvana and Soundgarden and all that stuff had sort of pushed through.
And at this point, like all the Swedish death metal and the first wave of death metal stuff has totally like knocked these guys out. You listen to Left Hand Path and you listen to
the Ritual,
and you're
it's
like
ew.
This is my dad's metal or something.
Yeah, and hair metal had kind of run its course as well. I mean, this was really like everybody's sort of dying fast and furious.
This is like all when Guns N' Roses this is like
Use Your Illusion came out.
So it's like they were kind of on the trail. It was just kind of a slow time.
It's a very strange, sort of transitional period of heavy metal at this point. And if you weren't Metallica in sort of pushing forth a new sound, I think this was almost their attempt at trying to like broaden out their audience a little bit, but it really fell flat. And I don't think they did enough.
No.
Like even the song that we're gonna play, which I think is probably the best song on this record, but it's Return to Serenity, and it's sort of their attempt at a Unforgiven or Nothing Else Matters type kind of balladry song. It's just too dark almost for the radio. I almost couldn't hear it on the radio, and it's almost too complex. Whereas Metallica got smart and really streamlined their sound and was really like efficient in what they were doing. And Testament was still caught up in some of the noodling stuff, which is cool, but it's not going to attract people who are listening to stripped down kind of grunge type sound. People wanted a return to songwriting. And but Return to Serenity, I think, is the peak of their type of sort of melodic songwriting in this early stage. And then we're going to take a sharp contrast after this, and the band kind of fell apart in a way. Skolniak leaves, Louis Clemente leaves, and they bring in a couple of new guys, which we'll talk about in the next set, and add some dynamics to their sound. So don't fear when you hear Return to Serenity fade out and the next song comes in. We're still playing Testament. It's still the same band. So we're going to go from Return to Serenity to Dogface Gods and Trail of Tears.
We just listened to Return to Serenity off of the Ritual album, and Dogface Gods and Trail of Tears off of Low.
And by this point, I think you and Chris were moving. You guys had started the magazine.
What year did Low come out? This was like
94.
94.
I mean, you guys were firmly
I was heavily
Sweden
into Carcass Country and
Norway and
every place else.
And for me, like 94, I think I was just coming out of my freshman year in high school. I was probably a sophomore in high school when this record came out. This was kind of the right time in terms of, the formation of my metal roots to get into a record like this. And I think this record was really a newborn identity for Testament, because I think they really fit themselves into that mid-90s sort of Roadrunner kind of sound that Machine Head and Obituary and Fear Factory and some of the kind of, they weren't mainstream, but they were like
They're
little
just
bit
on the cusp.
Yeah, like Sepultura, like we talked about on the last episode. They were on the cusp. KSID kind of like streamlined sound or something.
Yeah.
And so Low kind of hooked in with my friend Jeff and I, who Jeff's been on this program before when we did Repulsion and Enslaved, and it's again a reinvention of the sound, because Chuck Billy is attempting to sing in a more gruff death metal style, which you heard on Dogface Gods. And
which surprisingly sounds it's like a logical progression for his voice. He's always kind of had that raspiness, but he's never really dropped it guttural, and he's got it really, going back and listening to it 10 years later, it sounds really solid.
Yeah, and it's neat for you too, because this is probably something you dismissed, and for you to kind of be able to go back and go, you know what, like, I was just in a different place when I heard this record.
Sure.
That's happened to me as well. Like,
that's half the fun of this, is going back and reinventing all this, or reinvestigating all this stuff again, discovering it, and like, man, there's not a whole lot out there right now, but we go back and this stuff's great. So.
And I think historical context is always weird, because there's some bands that like were just overlooked at the time because there was a glut of other stuff happening that was like infinitely more interesting. But when you can kind of break it down and go, wow, for
when you see their longevity now too.
A bunch of guys that were in their mid 30s at this point probably. When the rest of their scene had gone mainstream, these guys decided to go the opposite way with like songs like Low and Dogface Gods, and Ride, and there's a whole handful of different sounds on here. And
was this their last record on Atlantic?
This is, I think, their last. Okay. Yep, this is their last. And in a way, it's almost like a middle finger to Atlantic, like saying, really. Hey, you guys didn't really do a whole lot for us to get us to the next level, so this is what we're gonna do for you. And it was really interesting production. It's got a really thick kind of sound, and the guy who did the production was a guy named Garth with 3 G's, which is kind of his little trademark thing. And I remember him from doing some work with the Melvins on Stoner Witch, and he did the first Rage Against the Machine. So again, they're bringing in somebody with a non-thrash sensibility to like add like a new fullness to their sound. Not to mention the fact that they've now brought in John Tempesta, who did some work with White Zombie and Exodus on drums, and he'll later, I think, do some work with Slayer and eventually end up back in Testament, which we'll get into later. And then one of our favorite kind of, I guess, roving guitar players, James Murphy, who played with Death and Obituary and Cancer, and
did his own thing with Disincarnate.
And so he comes on, and I think in a way, like we talked about earlier, this makes some of the original members like Christensen and Peterson and Billy, the 3 kind of remaining guys, they got to really up their game.
And it seems like they're pulling, who better than James Murphy to pull in to like legitimize them as this more extreme band too.
This isn't your grandfather and grandmother's guitar player. It's James Murphy from death metal bands, Obituary, Death, so it's an interesting record for that one fact, just with all these new guys kind of coming in, adding these new dynamics, and some songs work, some don't. I have a really endearing kind of connection with this record because it was like the first, I think, Testament CD I ever bought. And then I went back and heard New Order, I think, right afterwards.
That's an abrupt change.
Yeah, it is a weird change. And we should mention too that this is a new kind of cover artist that's going to be working with the band for a while. It's Dave McKean, who did some work with Paradise Lost. And not to mention, didn't he do some work with Paradise Lost?
He did the Shades of God cover.
And he's done some other things as well.
He did the first My Dying Bride record too.
That's right. I forgot about that. And he's really kind of does some neat things with collages and stuff. And it's got kind of a weird angel sort of feel going on. But in terms of Paradise Lost connection as well, you were the one who pointed this out because you hadn't really heard this song much before. But the last song we played in that set was Trail of Tears.
I kind of had that build like Draconian Time, just that really powerful like mid-90s sound. I can't think of any other band that did it quite as, identifiable as that.
Yeah, and I love it's one of my favorite Testament songs for sure. And again, it'd be hard for you to say that because you just heard it for the first time in probably 10 years, but that's one that I always have kind of gone back to, and it was sort of near and dear to us when we were back in high school. It's kind of one of those standard songs we always played.
A lot of angst in it.
Yeah, for sure. But so Low is, I think, in hindsight, is a really interesting album for them to see where they've kind of gone. And I think Low makes a lot more sense now when you hear the new record than it did probably back in '94. So, and the Testament will kind of continue their sound to move into another area with Demonic, and Demonic is an interesting record, but it's very stripped down, and it's only Peterson on guitars, so there's no great soloing work that Murphy and Skolniak did, and it's going to be probably about the most death metal record that they put out, and we're going to play a tune next called Burning Times, which I think is pretty representative of the whole record. Yeah. Got a cool theme, witchcraft and burning of witches and stuff, and but nothing like jumps out at you. It really just sort of is a real punchy kind of sound.
And this is this started their rotating lineup as well. So
and then we're gonna hear Burning Times and a couple of other tunes from the next record, which we won't talk about yet, called Legions of the Dead and True Believer. So enjoy Burning Times. Welcome back. You heard Burning Times from the record Demonic back from 97, and then a couple years later Testament put out, which I don't know, maybe for me is sort of my favorite of the newer stuff. I mean, obviously the new one is pretty hip as well, but you know, we'll see where it grows as time kind of moves on. But you heard Legions of the Dead and True Believer from The Gathering, which came out in 99, and Demonic, I should mention, this is sort of where they transition off Atlantic, and Fierce Mayhem put this record out, which had put out a lot of Anathema and My Dying Bride stuff, a lot of peaceful stuff.
A lot of peaceful stuff in the States.
So again, they're, you know, not only is they're upping their sound to death metal, but now they're starting to flirt with, you know, more death metal kind of labels and things like that.
Associating themselves, more in the niche market instead of the mainstream market.
Yeah, and what's interesting about Demonic too is Derek Ramirez played bass on that, and he was the original bassist for the Legacy, the pre-Testament band. So that's kind of a cool little ode to bring him in. And Gene Hoglan, one of our favorite traveling drummers, was playing the drums on Burning Times there, and it's got that middle part that's like, it's not even really a solo, but it just sort of drops down and it just sort of cranks and punches you right back in the face.
Well, this seems like, you know, Peterson's kind of stepped up to the plate and like, well, I'm not really a lead solo guitarist, but I can play faster than hell, and he really kind of injected some energy in that again.
Oh, sure.
I think he pulled a lot of that German thrash kind of destruction era riffs in there. It sounds great.
Yeah, and then, that German, thrash destruction sort of sound came really out in Legions of the Dead, which was from The Gathering. That's, short but sweet, but, Chuck's just going nuts on the vocals in that one. It's probably one of the heaviest songs I've ever heard Testament do. And what's cool about the title, Legions of the Dead, is it's almost an ode back to the Legacy, which had the Curse of the Legions of the Dead tune on it, so kind of band coming full circle and really realizing its past and its history. And Legacy had really been one of the heavier records they ever did at the time, and then it's sort of now they're kind of getting back to those sort of roots and dynamics. But the Gathering was put out by Burn Offerings and Spitfire Records, which I know had put out some Cathedral and Napalm Death, and
I think they're a sub-label of Century Media.
Is that what they are? Yeah. Okay.
Or they were their own, but I think they've been absorbed by Century Media since then.
Which makes sense, based on some of the lineup changes and stuff like that. Ooh, looks like it's getting dark. It's getting dark and stormy. Yeah, it's about 5:00 in the afternoon, but this is it's black, pitch black metal weather. But the Gathering was cool because it was like a super group, really. James Murphy back on guitar. Dave Lombardo, maybe you've heard of that guy before, from Slayer on drums, and then Steve
Grip Inc. perhaps.
Or Grip Incorporated, or Fantomas even.
Yep.
And then Steve DiGiorgio on bass, and he was from Sadist and not Sadist, Sadus. Did he do some work with Death? I want to say.
Yeah, he was on
Individual?
on Human.
Oh yeah, he's on Human. Oh yeah,
he's been on a bunch of other records that I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. But he's almost as prolific as Gene Hoglan as far as jumping around from band to band.
And James Murphy. I mean, this is really like the traveling Wilburys kind of record of Testament or something. But it's a record you hadn't really ever heard before, because I think wherever you were at in terms of your metal listening.
Well, this was in '99. This came out.
Yeah, I think you were this is when you had dropped out for a while.
A little bit, yeah. I was just sticking to kind of what I knew and not. And after I saw, you look at the promo cover of this, and it's abysmal. It's horrible looking.
It's really bad. It's like a close-up of a black and white, like, pentagram or something. And
it's just...
This is the copy.
I was just kind of done at that point, yeah.
And this is the copy I got for a review, which I reviewed back in Eclipse number 3. And I was pretty jonesed about it because I was a huge Slayer fan and a huge Death fan, so... The addition
99 was whenever the whole scene was kind of taking another hit, another lull.
Yeah, for sure. This is really before kind of the rebirth, I think, of the 2000s kind of happened. Yeah. But it's generally a really interesting record and features some really dynamic individual performances, a lot of great solos, and just some really intense drumming and intense bass playing. I mean, it really pushes everything into the stratosphere for a while. Yeah. And unfortunately, this is when Testament sort of gets hit with tragedy, James Murphy was diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah, cancer and metal. What's the deal,
Yeah,
and it's like extreme, like brains and testicles kind of stuff going on here.
So. Well, James Murphy had brain cancer just like Chuck from Death did. Yeah. And he successfully had surgery on it, and now he's doing fine. But in fact, I read about the fact that he doesn't even remember recording this record.
Yeah, I think it kind of knocked a lot of his short-term or long-term memory, how completely,
which is really scary. Really scary. And then a couple years later, in 2001, Chuck Billy gets diagnosed with like a rare form of testicular cancer, but it actually moved up into his heart and lungs. I mean, this is
he was pretty much out of the game for a while.
Till like 2003, 2004, and luckily he made a comeback. But I know for a while they talked about whether or not he would even be able to come back and sing because it attacked his lungs and stuff.
After that point, he kind of dropped the register even more on his voice. He never got back to that, practice what you preach era. Except on the new record, he gets pretty darn close.
Yeah,
which is pretty neat how they kind of like combined all that stuff together.
Yep, absolutely. It's a cool. It's just great to know that this band was able to survive not only grunge, 2 cancers, bandmates leaving, and what's really fascinating about this is that. These guys will all return. Skolniak around this time re-recorded some of the early tunes with them on the
First Strike is Deadly.
First Strike is Deadly, which I think they put out in 2002, and they actually went out of print. But I think Prosthetic Records just put it out a couple years back, or just this year, I think, reintroduced it. And then they're going to kind of go on a lull and have a lot of lineup changes, some touring things. There's some benefit shows for Chuck, and then they disappear off the map, and you almost don't hear from Testament for 5 years almost.
Yeah.
And then 2008 comes around, and here we go with the original lineup. minus John Tempesta on drums. So he's replaced Louis Clemente, which is probably for the better in terms of musicality. And they put out this great record, which just came out a few weeks ago.
Well, this is Bostaff on drums.
Is this Bostaff?
Yeah.
Not Tempesta?
No.
Okay, I'm on crack. I don't know.
But
So-
it was still, it's a step up from Clemente. I mean, it's like everybody's finally kind of seemed like they're everybody's on the same level musically.
I was thinking of Tempesta because he's on First Strike is Deadly. That was what was screwing me up. But we got
Bostaff. Christensen back, Skolnick's back in the fold. It's basically the original lineup minus Clemente, but this is a good improvement.
Yeah, the weakest link is taken out, and this is great stuff.
And this is interesting because this is the first record I bought from Testament since The Ritual, and going back and hearing The Gathering, these other records, seeing like what kind of happened in their what I thought was their floundering days, come back and actually seems like everything seems more democratic. Like Peterson's got a lot more input on. You can definitely hear it on his songwriting on the record. But then you've got Skolnick coming in and totally like blowing the doors off with the solos, and then Bostaff's drumming and Christensen's bass playing is fantastic.
Sure,
it's not quite as fluid as DiGiorgio's, but it's definitely like. It's top notch.
But I think you said democratic. I think everybody's sort of reined in a little bit.
It seems like everybody's playing to their strengths on the record, really well.
Because it used to be on those like first few Testament records, like almost all the band's sound would sort of drop out for Skolnick to sort of rise up with a spotlight on him to play the solos.
Basically, and coming up through the floor of the spotlight thing.
The production's so thick and together. I mean, it's a really thick, meaty kind of record. And this tune we both agreed on is sort of a standard favorite of ours right off the bat. And it's from this new record called The Formation of Damnation. It's called Persecuted Won't Forget. And it has a real sort of German thrash kind of sound, almost destruction.
Yeah, it's got Sons of Death kind of sound on it. It's really nice. But then it manages to pull in, like, they drop out of that into, like, a stock, like, great thrash riff. Really chunky, just really... This is, like, we've talked about a lot of bands kind of return to form kind of thing, but this is, like, return to form, but, like, amp it up and bring all the baggage with them and just, like... make a fantastic record.
Yeah, and I think all the tension that was created over the years between these guys breaking up and band members leaving and coming back and stuff has probably contributed to a much more emotionally resonant sort of record that you can hear on here. I mean, these guys are serious. They're not just cashing in to make money on a comeback tour. They're really putting it all out
this
there.
isn't like a Judas Priest reunion thing. This is like everybody's got full of piss and vinegar and they're ready to go.
So cool. That's what we're gonna end things with. Here is Persecuted Won't Forget. Enjoy.
And I think we'll just that'll be the last Talkset as well.
Yeah, so if you have some comments or thoughts on what we've done, or if you are an old school Testament fan and disagree with some of the choices we made,
more about the politics, let us know.
I'm sure you do. So we're just, like I said, coming into this because we're interested, we're big fans, and we're kind of trying to piece together and logically make sense of the Testament's history on our own.
Yep.
But if you want to write us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com or REQUIEM podcast@gmail.com.
And you can also visit our website, which is in the process. You can go listen to all of our back podcasts there at requiempodcast.com, and we've got the entire list and all the enhanced podcasts that have track breaks and artwork and all the extras. Actually, some of them are it's the unedited versions as well, so some are considerably longer than
because you've had to condense some shows like Enslaved and Paradise Lost down
we kind
a
of
little
knocked
bit.
those down just to keep it on our server right now. So
and we're trying to find some more bandwidth for you guys so that we can get these shows to be the length that they need to be, which is whatever we need it to be at the time. So we hope you enjoyed some thrashing Testament this week, and we hope that you keep listening and give us some feedback. We're really looking to know what we can do to make things better and improve our craft, if you will.
That's right. So enjoy Persecuted Won't Forget.
Yeah, this is Jason
and Mark.
And